There is a word you use all the time, and you have absolutely no idea where it comes from. You wear it on t-shirts. You stream shows soaked in it. You walk past buildings made of it every single day in every American city. Gothic. Dark, jagged, dramatic, a little frightening. The whole aesthetic that billions of people associate with mystery and edge and something ancient and unnameable. And here is the part nobody ever stops to think about. That word is the name of real people, actual human beings who lived, loved, ate, prayed, fought, and died. People who were so terrifying to the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen that Rome, with its legions and its walls and its centuries of domination over everything from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of Syria, genuinely did not know what to do with them. And yet, the story you have been told about those people is almost completely wrong. You have been sold a cartoon. Unwashed savages in animal skins, brutes swinging axes, the barbarian horde that burned civilization to the ground and dragged humanity into 1,000 years of darkness. That is the version that made it into every Hollywood epic, and every history class, and every casual reference to the fall of Rome. But what if the Goths were not the destroyers of the world you live in? What if they were, in ways you have never been told, the builders of it? What if the word you use to describe your favorite aesthetic, your favorite architecture, your favorite literature, is actually a slur? An insult hurled by people who were terrified that something new and powerful was replacing everything they thought was permanent. This is the story of who the Goths actually were. Not the cartoon, not the footnote in a Roman history book. The real people. Where they came from, how they lived, what they believed, why they ran toward Rome instead of away from it. And what it means that their names survived. Twisted, distorted, misunderstood, all the way to the clothes on your back and the music in your headphones right now. And look, if any part of this story makes you want to keep watching, and it will, hit subscribe. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching this from and what time it is. Seriously, I want to know if someone is watching this at 3 in the morning in Portland or at noon in Atlanta. This community is everywhere, and this story belongs to all of you. Now, let's go back to a time before Rome was afraid. Picture a coastline in the far north. Cold, gray, relentless. The Baltic Sea in a season when the water looks like hammered iron, and the sky sits so low you feel like you could reach up and press your palm against it. Somewhere along that coast, in the region of what is now southern Scandinavia and the northern edge of modern Poland, a people called themselves something that sounded roughly like the Teutons, the Goths. According to their own legend, recorded by the Gothic historian Jordanes in the 6th century, the Goths originated in southern Scandinavia and crossed in 3 ships under their king Berig to the southern shore of the Baltic Sea, where they settled after defeating other Germanic peoples in the area. 3 ships. The story of an entire civilization begins with 3 boats disappearing into a gray northern sea, carrying a king and his people toward a coast they had never seen. Historians argue about how literally to take that legend. Little is definitively known about the origins of the Goths before the Romans encountered them. They may have come from Scandinavia, according to some sources, or from what is now modern-day Poland. What the archaeology does confirm is this. The Goths were a Germanic people who likely originated in Scandinavia and, over several centuries, migrated south through the Baltic region, eventually establishing themselves across a vast stretch of Central and Eastern Europe. By the 2nd century, Gothic communities occupied a dynamic frontier zone at the edge of the Roman Empire, trading with merchants to the south and maintaining ties with Baltic peoples to the north. They were moving, always moving, not randomly, not desperately, purposefully, across generations, carrying their language and their customs and their identity intact through every landscape they crossed. The fact that the expanding Goths appear to have preserved their Gothic language during this movement suggests that it involved a fairly large number of people. You do not preserve a language across hundreds of miles and hundreds of years by accident. You do it because that language is who you are. Because it carries your gods and your laws and the names of your dead. And here is something that already cracks the cartoon open. Far from being isolated tribalists huddled in fear of the outside world, the ancient Goths appear to have been remarkably cosmopolitan. By the time they had established their great cultural zone on the steppes north of the Danube, in the lands that are now Ukraine and Moldova and Romania, they were absorbing influences from every direction, from Sarmatian horsemen from the east, from Dacian farmers to the south, from Roman traders who came upriver with wine and silver and new ideas. Their culture included Iranian, Dacian, Roman, and probably Slavic elements as well. The frontier was not a wall for the Goths, it was a door. But before we can understand what the Goths became, we need to understand what they were, the texture of their actual lives, the sound of their villages at dawn, the weight of their beliefs. Almost nobody ever talks about that part. The archaeological record speaks volumes if you know how to listen to it. The Gothic settlements of this era were largely permanent. They were farmers who grew wheat, barley, and millet. Archaeologists have found plowshares, sickles, and scythes. Cattle were their primary livestock. This is not the wandering horde of Hollywood epics. These are people with fields to plant and harvests to protect, and animals to feed through long northern winters, people with something to lose. And their material culture, the objects they made and buried and left behind for us to find 2,000 years later, tells a story that is startling in its sophistication. Before the Huns disrupted everything, the Gothic Cherniakov culture produced jewelry, containers, and decorations. Their style was heavily influenced by Greek and Roman artists. They developed a distinctive, colorful style of goldwork, using cells or settings to embed gemstones into their gold objects. Read that carefully. These are the people Rome called savages, and they were doing gem-inlay goldwork so refined that pieces of it still sit in museums today, making scholars catch their breath. Gothic graves often include pottery, bone combs, and iron tools, but notably, almost never weapons. In a culture supposedly defined by war and violence, the everyday dead, the farmers and craftspeople and mothers and fathers buried outside their villages, went into the ground with combs and pots and tools, not swords. The weapons in their graves are the exception, not the rule. The picture that emerges is not a society built entirely around violence. It is a society built around work, around daily life, around the ordinary rhythms of people trying to feed their children and honor their dead. Their burial practices are themselves a window into something complex and layered. The Goths used two main ways to bury their dead: inhumation, meaning burying the body whole, and cremation. They often buried items with the dead: pottery, iron tools, and bone combs, as well as personal ornaments. The coexistence of both practices in the same communities, and this was not unique to the Goths among Germanic peoples, but it is striking here because we have such good archaeological evidence for it, suggests a spiritual world that was genuinely diverse, genuinely in conversation with itself. Imagine you are a Gothic woman living in one of those villages. You wake before dawn in a timber house half sunken into the earth, designed that way deliberately, so the ground itself holds the warmth from your fire through the long night. Outside, frost on the grass, the low moan of cattle in the dark. You know every person in this village of maybe 60 or 80 souls. You know who is sick and who was born last winter and who has not come back from the eastern pastures. Later today there will be a feast, not just food, but something more, a ritual, something that holds everyone together. Each Gothic village held sacrificial meals as offerings to pagan idols. These feasts were not merely religious acts, but also social events that reinforced community bonds and collective identity. A key figure in these rituals was the Rakes, a leader who combined political, military, and religious authority. The Rakes was the axis around which the village turned, not a distant king in a distant palace, but someone who sat at the same fire as you did, who knew your name. The center of the Gothic cult was the village or clan, the cuni, and the ritual sacrificial meal held by the villagers under the leadership of the rakes, who saw themselves as the guardians of ethnic tradition. This word, cuni, is worth holding for a moment. It means clan. It means kin. It means the web of people whose fate is bound to yours. Everything in Gothic society radiated outward from that center. The rakes led the feast and guarded the old ways and decided when it was time to move and where to go next. The free men, the core of Gothic society, neither nobles nor slaves, formed the backbone of the community. Gothic society was hierarchical in nature. At the top were the nobles and warriors, individuals who earned their positions through valor and lineage. Beneath them were the free men, and at the bottom were the slaves, often prisoners captured during warfare. Something the cartoon never shows you: in a Gothic village of 50 to 100 people, there were only 4 or 5 elite couples. 4 or 5. Everyone else was ordinary. The vast majority of Goths were simply people, farming, crafting, raising children, burying their dead with bone combs and clay pots. The warriors and nobles that loom so large in the Roman imagination were always a thin layer on top of something much more human and much more recognizable. Their religion before Christianity was what scholars call Germanic paganism, a world full of gods and spirits not entirely unlike what the Norse believed, with figures recognizable as early versions of Odin and Thor, gods of war and thunder and wisdom, powers that lived not in remote heavens, but threaded through the everyday world. Early Gothic paganism is not extensively documented, but existing evidence allows scholars to piece together a reasonable outline. Gothic religion was a form of ancient Germanic polytheism, closely aligned with the beliefs of other early Germanic peoples, including the Scandinavians. The night sky was not just beautiful to a Goth standing in a Ukrainian field 2,000 years ago. It was alive. It was listening. And then something happened to that spiritual world that almost no one in a story about the Goths ever talks about. Something so radical, so astonishing in its implications, that it altered not just what the Goths believed, but what every German-speaking people in the history of the world would eventually inherit. A man named Ulfilas, or Wulfila in his own language, which means roughly little wolf. Ulfilas was a Christian bishop and missionary who evangelized the Goths, created the Gothic alphabet, and produced what is recognized as the earliest surviving written text in any Germanic language, a translation of the Bible. Let that land. Not just the first Gothic Bible, the first written literary work in any Germanic tongue. The earliest point at which a Germanic language was committed to the page in a form that has survived to the present day. That is not the same as saying Ulfilas invented Germanic languages, or that his work is somehow the ancestor of every word in English or German or Norse. Those languages were alive and evolving for centuries before Ulfilas put pen to vellum. But as the first written monument in that entire family of languages, his Bible stands at the beginning of a literary tradition that would eventually branch into every written form of English, German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. Gothic was not a written language before him. Ulfilas therefore faced a translating challenge that called for exceptional ingenuity. Ancient ecclesiastical historians credit him with the invention of the Gothic alphabet of 27 symbols, based primarily on the Greek and Latin alphabets. He sat down and built a writing system from scratch for a people who had never had one, so that he could give them the words that had changed his life, and in doing so, he gave the entire Germanic world its first literary tradition. There is something almost vertiginous about that. Every time you read English, every sentence in every novel, every text message, every word on every screen, you are at the end of a chain that runs through centuries of German and Anglo-Saxon and Norse writing. And at the far end of that chain, almost invisible in the distance, is a man called Little Wolf, sitting somewhere in the Gothic borderlands in the 4th century, scratching letters into something that would survive the fall of every empire that came after him. He also made a choice that is deeply strange when you look at it closely. According to some ancient ecclesiastical historians, Ulfilas deliberately excluded the books of Samuel and Kings from his translation, reportedly out of concern that their numerous accounts of warfare might further inflame what he saw as the already martial temperament of the Gothic people. Historians debate whether this exclusion was truly intentional or whether those books were simply lost or left unfinished. The evidence is not conclusive. But even as a reported decision, it reveals something important. The man translating the Bible for the Goths knew his audience intimately enough that he was thinking line by line about what they needed and what they did not. He knew exactly who he was dealing with. Because by the time Ulfilas was doing his work, the Goths and Rome had already been in a complicated, dangerous, fascinating relationship for more than a century. The first incursion into Roman territory attributable to the Goths was the sack of a city near the mouth of the Danube in the year 238. For context, that is 170 years before the famous sack of Rome itself. For 170 years, these two worlds, the Gothic world north of the Danube and the Roman world south of it, circled each other, raided each other, traded with each other, hired each other, feared each other, needed each other. Large numbers of Goths joined the Roman military. They wore Roman armor and carried Roman weapons and swore oaths to Roman emperors. And Roman merchants crossed the river going north, setting up shops in Gothic towns, bringing the tastes and textures of the Mediterranean into villages where people had never seen an olive. Between roughly the years 238 and 400, while there certainly were clashes between the armies of Rome and the Goths, a sizable portion of the population of the Roman Empire itself was Gothic, and these Goths had adopted the Roman way of life. Read that and feel the ground shift under the story you thought you knew. The Goths were not outside the walls shaking their fists. A huge number of them were inside, living, working, serving, building. The line between Roman and Goth was, for much of this period, genuinely blurry. Not a wall, a membrane. And yet Rome never stopped calling them barbarians, never stopped looking at them with a particular kind of contempt. The contempt of a civilization that has decided its own way of doing things is the only way that counts. The word barbarian, remember, comes from the Greek. It was the sound of a foreign language in Roman ears. Bar, 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 like noise, like nonsense. It was the sound of someone speaking, and a Roman choosing not to listen. The Goths are either traditionally blamed for the destruction of the civilization of the Roman Empire that plunged Western culture into a dark age, or celebrated as heroes who refused to bear the yoke of Rome submissively. Both of those framings miss the actual story. The actual story is much stranger. Because the Goths did not want to destroy Rome. For most of their history, what they wanted, desperately, urgently, at great cost, was to be let in. The movement of Gothic people over vast geographical distances was driven by a variety of factors, including climatic changes, population pressures, and the allure of Roman wealth and stability. The allure. They were drawn toward Rome the way people are always drawn toward warmth and light and the smell of bread in a city when you have been sleeping in the cold. And then something arrived from the east that turned all of that longing into a stampede. The Huns. Moving out of the Central Asian steppe like a force of nature, with no apparent edge, no visible limit. In the late 4th century, the lands of the Goths in present-day Ukraine were overwhelmed by a significant westward movement of Alans and Huns from the east, peoples who had been settled for generations, farming their fields, burying their dead with bone combs, inlaying gems into gold with steady hands, suddenly found themselves between two worlds, with no safe ground to stand on. Everything the Goths had built on the Ukrainian steppe, everything that had grown up over those long centuries of settlement and cultural mixing, the villages, the cult feasts, the intricate goldwork, the web of the Cuni, all of it was suddenly in danger of being swallowed. Large numbers of Goths began to concentrate near the Roman border at the lower Danube. Tens of thousands of people, men, women, children, livestock, everything they could carry, pressing up against the river that had been the edge of the Roman world for centuries, looking south across the water at the empire that had always been there, enormous, powerful, permanent. And they were asking to be let in. What happened next is one of the most consequential decisions in the history of Western civilization. And the Romans, with all their centuries of law and governance and supposedly superior wisdom, made the worst possible call. The Emperor Valens said yes. That is the decision. 3 words that do not begin to contain what they actually meant. In the year 376, Valens authorized the crossing of the Danube, allowed the Goths to enter Roman territory as refugees, as settlers, as people seeking protection from the storm coming out of the east. On the surface, it looked like generosity. It looked like Rome absorbing another wave of useful people, as Rome had done dozens of times before. Gothic fighters had served in Roman armies for generations. Gothic men had risen to high rank in Roman institutions. This was not unprecedented. Valens looked at the river full of desperate people and saw soldiers, saw tax revenue, saw a workforce for underpopulated Roman provinces in the Balkans. He saw everything except what was actually there. What was actually there was an entire civilization, not a raiding party, not a regiment of recruits, a people, women with children on their hips, old men who remembered the Ukrainian steppe as it had been before the Huns arrived, priests carrying what was left of their sacred objects, craftsmen with tools they had inherited from their fathers, farmers who had left fields half-plowed because there was no time, because the Huns do not wait for the harvest. Estimates of the number of Goths who crossed vary enormously, but the scale was unlike anything Rome had managed before. This was not immigration. This was the relocation of a world. And then Rome did what corrupt, overstretched, organizationally rotting empires do when they encounter a situation that requires them to be better than they are. The Roman officials responsible for receiving and provisioning the Gothic refugees exploited them savagely. They were supposed to be fed. They were not fed. They were supposed to be given land. The land never materialized. Instead, the Roman officers on the ground saw an opportunity, a captive population with no leverage and no recourse, and they squeezed it. The Goths were forced to trade their children into slavery for dog meat. Dog meat. People who had crossed the Danube carrying everything they owned, who had fled one catastrophe only to walk into another, were so hungry within months of arriving in the empire they had spent generations wanting to join, that they were trading their sons and daughters for food that Romans would not eat themselves. Stand in that moment for a second. Feel what it feels like. You have survived the Huns. You have crossed the river. You're inside the walls of the greatest empire in the world, and you believed, you had every reason to believe, that the worst was behind you, and instead, you are watching your child be led away by a Roman officer while someone hands you a piece of meat that is not what human beings are supposed to eat. The hunger in your stomach is nothing compared to what is happening to your understanding of the world. What followed was not a barbarian invasion, it was a rebellion. And there is a difference that matters enormously, a difference that the official Roman account of events worked very hard to obscure, and that most popular history has been obscuring ever since. The Gothic uprising that began in 377 was not a horde of savages attacking civilization. It was a group of people who had been systematically betrayed by the civilization they had asked to join, responding in the only language that civilization had left them. The Goths, under their leader Fritigern, a man who had himself converted to Christianity, who had worked to maintain peace with Rome, who had tried every available diplomatic channel before giving up, began raiding the surrounding countryside. They were not alone. Desperate and hungry people are not picky about alliances. Some Roman slaves joined them. Hunnic and Alan warriors who had crossed the Danube with the Goths joined them. Miners from the local region who had their own grievances against Roman authorities joined them. What began as a Gothic refugee crisis rapidly became something more complex and more volatile. A coalition of the abandoned, moving through the Balkans like a fire that keeps finding new fuel. Valens marched to meet them. He had spent the previous months in a war against Persia, and he arrived in the Balkans with an army that was tired and a commander who was annoyed, and an ego that was, as it turned out, badly miscalibrated. He had an opportunity to wait for reinforcements from his co-emperor Gratian, who was moving west with additional troops. He chose not to wait. Whether it was impatience or arrogance, or a genuine tactical miscalculation that historians still argue about, Valens decided he could handle this himself. On an August afternoon in the year 378, outside a city called Adrianople, in what is now northwestern Turkey, the two forces met. The battle lasted perhaps 2 hours. In those 2 hours, somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of the Roman Eastern Field Army was destroyed. Valens himself was killed, the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy in more than a century. His body was never found. Let the scale of that register. Rome had been losing battles for centuries. Every empire loses battles. But Adrianople was not a lost battle. It was a rupture, an event so catastrophic that writers in Rome at the time reached for comparisons and kept landing on Cannae, the battle where Hannibal had nearly ended Rome 600 years earlier. Edward Gibbon, writing 14 centuries after the event, described Adrianople as the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire. There are historians who push back on that framing, who argue that the fall of Rome had too many causes to pin on a single afternoon in Thrace. They are probably right. But Adrianople was the moment when something that had been cracking for a long time finally broke through the surface. After Adrianople, Rome could not expel the Goths, could not defeat them, could not pretend they were not there. The new emperor, Theodosius, eventually negotiated a settlement in the year 382 that gave the Goths something unprecedented in Roman history: the right to live inside the empire as a self-governing people, under their own leaders, by their own laws. Foederati, the Romans called them, allies. The word was technically accurate and spiritually hollow. What it actually meant was that Rome had absorbed a nation it could not digest, a people who were now inside the empire's body, but not of it, armed and organized and governed by their own customs, occupying Roman land on terms that Rome had never granted to anyone before. This is not a footnote. This is the hinge on which the next century turns. Because who were these people, exactly, who had just forced the greatest empire in the world to rewrite its own rules? What did they believe? How did they govern themselves? What did their days actually look and feel and sound like? Rome had a story about them. Rome had always had a story about them. And like most stories told by the powerful about the powerless, it was designed to explain why the powerful's behavior was justified and the powerless's suffering was deserved. But the actual Gothic world, the one you can piece together from archaeology and Gothic sources and careful reading of even hostile Roman accounts, is almost nothing like the Roman story. Start with what held their world together, because it is not what you expect. Gothic society was organized around something that had no exact Roman equivalent: a web of loyalty and obligation that radiated outward from the cuni, from that core unit of kin and clan, all the way up through the structure of their confederacies. A Gothic king, a Theodens in their own language, was not a monarch in the Roman sense. He did not inherit absolute power. He held his position through a combination of lineage, success, and the continued consent of the free men beneath him. When a Gothic king failed, in battle, in judgment, in the provision of what his people needed, he could be replaced, not through a formal democratic process with ballots and counts, but through the brutal, informal pressure of a warrior society, withdrawal of support, defection to a rival, or in extreme cases, something considerably more permanent. This meant that Gothic leaders had to actually lead. They could not govern from behind walls and bureaucracies the way Roman emperors increasingly did. A Gothic Rex, or Theodens, ate with his men. He fought when there was fighting. He was visible. He was present. He was legible to the people whose loyalty he required. Theodosius, negotiating with Gothic leaders after Adrianople, was dealing with men who held power in a completely different way than he did. Men who could not simply order their followers to comply, because compliance was not the deal. The deal was reciprocity. I protect you. I lead you. I feast with you. And in return, you follow. The moment that contract broke down, everything broke down. That reciprocity showed up everywhere in Gothic culture. Their feasts, the sacrificial communal meals that sat at the heart of their pagan religious life, were not merely eating. They were the renewal of the social contract, repeated in ritual form. The sharing of food and drink was the sharing of fate. When a Reichs hosted a feast, he was demonstrating his ability to provide. When his people ate, they were demonstrating their continued trust. Take away the feast, and you have not just ended a tradition, you have severed the cord that holds the community together. Their hospitality was famous even among Romans who otherwise looked down on them. A stranger who arrived at a Gothic settlement was fed before being asked any questions. Not after, before. You fed the person first and found out who they were later, because the obligation to care for a guest preceded the right to interrogate one. Salvian of Marseille, a 5th century Christian writer who was decidedly not a Gothic enthusiast, and had every reason to favor his own civilization, nevertheless wrote that among the barbarians there is no inhumanity except that which they have learned from the Romans. That is a Roman priest saying, in the 5th century, that the Goths treated people better than Rome did. He was not alone in this observation. It kept coming up. Gothic law, the traditions they carried, and eventually, much later, wrote down, was rooted in compensation rather than punishment for its own sake. If you harmed someone, the mechanism of justice was not primarily about making you suffer. It was about making the harmed person and their family whole again. The weregild, the man price, the gold that restored the balance when blood had been spilled, was a sophisticated system for containing violence in a world where violence was always close to the surface. It said, this person's life had a value, and that value can be honored even in their death, and we can find a way through this that does not require everyone's sons to kill everyone else's sons forever. This is not primitive. This is practical wisdom about how a community of armed people can survive itself. Their clothing was a canvas of identity. Gothic men and women wore garments of wool and linen, often decorated with intricate patterns using the brooch and pin technology they had developed over centuries of settlement and trade. The fibulae, the ornamental clasps that held cloaks and garments together, were often pieces of genuine artistic achievement, cast in bronze or silver, sometimes inlaid with garnets or glass in brilliant polychrome patterns that would later influence the entire decorative tradition of early medieval Europe. When you look at the treasures in a museum case and you see a piece of Germanic jewelry from the 5th or 6th century, that characteristic style of flat gold set with vivid red stones, cells of garnet catching the light, you are looking at a tradition that the Goths carried across a continent. The beauty did not die when Rome fell. It transformed. Their language, the Gothic that Ulfilas had captured in his alphabet, was a living instrument of enormous expressiveness. It had cases. It distinguished who was doing something and who was having it done to them through the shape of the word itself, not the order of the words in a sentence. It had a dual number, a grammatical form for exactly two of something, a way of saying the two of us that was built into the structure of the language rather than added on top. When Ulfilas translated the Lord's Prayer into Gothic, he was not simply converting words from one code to another. He was finding the Gothic soul inside Latin and Greek sentences, finding where those ideas lived in a language that had been shaped by cold coastlines and long migrations, and the particular texture of Gothic life. Their beliefs, even before Ulfilas arrived with his alphabet and his Bible, were richer and stranger than the Roman stereotype allowed. The pagan Gothic world was saturated with the sacred, not segregated into temples and priests and scheduled worship, the way Roman religion increasingly was, but woven into everything. The turning of seasons, the behavior of cattle, the patterns of weather, the outcomes of battles. All of it was legible to someone who knew how to read it. Gothic priests and priestesses, the latter particularly significant, women who held religious authority in ways Roman religion was increasingly closing off, mediated between the community and the forces that governed its fate. There is a figure in the Gothic world called the Halirunai, women who were believed to possess supernatural knowledge, who could communicate with the dead and see across time. When the Gothic king Philomer, according to their own tradition, expelled a group of these women from the Gothic host during the migration period, the legend says they wandered into the wilderness and produced offspring with evil spirits, and those offspring were the ancestors of the Huns. That story is not history, but it is extraordinarily revealing about how the Gothic imagination worked, about what they feared and what they valued, and how they made sense of catastrophe. It takes the most terrifying enemy the Goths had ever faced and explains it through displaced spiritual power, through women cast out, and the terrible consequences of that casting out. Which brings us back to the catastrophe still in progress, the settlement of 382, the foederati arrangement that gave the Goths their unprecedented semi-autonomous status inside the empire, did not resolve anything. It paused the explosion. The underlying pressure was still there. All that accumulated grievance, all those unanswered questions about what kind of future was actually available to a Gothic person inside Rome's story. Could a Goth rise to genuine power? Could a Goth's children grow up Roman and be accepted as such? Or would the contempt always be there, just below the surface, ready to surface whenever a Roman of sufficient arrogance decided to remind you what you actually were? The next decades gave some answers. Gothic generals rose to extraordinary prominence in the Roman military, men like Stilicho, whose father was a Vandal and whose mother was Roman, who became in effect the most powerful man in the Western Empire during the reign of the young emperor Honorius. Stilicho commanded Roman armies, defeated enemies of Rome, arranged marriages and alliances at the highest levels of imperial society. He was also never fully trusted, never fully accepted. The whisper of his barbarian blood followed him everywhere, and when he fell, when the political tide turned against him in 408, he was executed on charges that historians still argue about, and in the anti-barbarian hysteria that followed his death, thousands of barbarian soldiers serving in the Roman army defected in fury and grief. They defected to Alaric. Alaric. The name lands like a stone in still water, and the ripples are still moving. A Gothic leader of the Baltic dynasty, a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to find a permanent, legitimate place for his people inside the Roman world, and had been denied one at every turn. He had served Rome. He had fought Rome's enemies. He had asked for a formal military command, the kind of title and authority that would have made him and his followers genuinely Roman in status, not just useful barbarians to be deployed and discarded. Rome's answer had always been the same kind of no that exhausted empires specialize in. Not a direct refusal, but a deferral, a delay, a promise that dissolved when you tried to hold it. By 408, Alaric had run out of patience. He had an army of Goths camped in Italy, an army that had been moving through the peninsula for years, besieging and departing, extracting payments, making demands that Rome kept finding reasons not to fully meet. And then Stilicho was dead, and the buffer between Alaric and the worst impulses of the imperial court at Ravenna was gone, and there was no one left to negotiate in good faith, because the people who might have done so were either dead or running. Picture Rome in those years. Not the city of the glossy documentaries, gleaming marble and cheerful citizens in immaculate togas. The Rome of 408 was already a city in managed decline. Population had shrunk from perhaps 1 million at the city's peak to something considerably less. The aqueducts still ran, the forums were still imposing, the Colosseum still rose against the sky, but the court was in Ravenna now. 200 miles to the north, protected by marshes. The Emperor Honorius, a man whose most famous biography includes the story that when he heard Rome had fallen, he reportedly worried about a beloved pet chicken before realizing they meant the city, was governing, if you could call it that, from behind his swamp. He had no serious interest in negotiating with Alaric. His advisors had various interests, almost none of which aligned with the actual well-being of the city that was about to pay the price for their incompetence. On the 24th of August, in the year 410, the gates of Rome were opened. By whom remains a subject of historical debate, possibly by slaves hoping for liberation, possibly by Gothic sympathizers inside the city, and Alaric's army walked in. They sacked Rome for 3 days. 3 days. And then they left. Loaded with treasure, yes, gold and silver and centuries of accumulated Roman wealth stripped from temples and mansions and storehouses. The city suffered real damage. Fires broke out, some districts were badly hit, and the trauma to the population was severe, regardless of what burned and what did not. But the Goths did not attempt to raze the city wholesale. They did not slaughter the population in the way that ancient armies routinely did to conquered cities, and they respected the churches. This matters, because Alaric himself was Christian, and his Goths were largely Christian, and the sack of Rome in 410 was carried out by people who had been inside the Roman world for decades, and who carried Roman coins, and wore Roman styles, and worshipped in a tradition that had roots in the same soil as the faith of the people they were sacking. The Basilica of St. Peter, the Basilica of St. Paul, these were declared sanctuaries. People who fled there were not touched. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem when he heard the news, produced one of the great expressions of historical grief in any language. He wrote, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" He was not describing a military defeat. He was describing the collapse of a mental architecture, the destruction of the certainty that some things are permanent, that some walls cannot fall, that the world you were born into will be the world you die in. Rome had not just been a city. It had been a proof of concept, the proof that civilization was real and durable and protected by forces strong enough to hold the chaos at bay forever. And now, the proof was gone. Peer past the official narrative of civilization versus barbarism, and look at what was actually in those streets. A Gothic king, who is a Christian, leading an army largely composed of Christians, through a city that is the spiritual capital of Christianity, destroying carefully and selectively, preserving sacred spaces, killing far fewer people than Roman armies routinely killed in their own conquered territories. A man who has spent the better part of 2 decades trying to work within the Roman system, being forced by that system's failures into the one action that will define him in every textbook forever. And Rome, the empire that called everyone else barbaric, destroyed not by savages from outside, but by the accumulated weight of its own corruption, its own short-sightedness, its own inability to treat the people it needed as anything other than tools, to be used and discarded. Alaric died later that same year, 410, somewhere in the toe of Italy, moving south in search of ships to cross to North Africa. He was young, perhaps 40. His people buried him, according to Gothic tradition, in the bed of the Busento River, which they temporarily diverted to create a grave below the riverbed. Then they restored the river to its course and killed the men who had dug the grave, so the location would never be known. He has never been found. The man who sacked Rome is buried in a riverbed in southern Italy, and nobody knows exactly where. The man whose name became synonymous with the fall of Western civilization was hidden by his own people so completely that 2,000 years of searching has not turned him up. There is something almost mythic about that, something that belongs in the oldest stories, the king who returns to the earth, the leader whose body becomes part of the land he moved across. And the Gothic story did not end there. It did not even pause, because after Alaric, after that seismic 3 days in August that made Jerome weep in Bethlehem and made Honorius panic about his chicken, the Goths kept going. They moved west. Under Alaric's successor, Ataulf, who married Galla Placidia, the actual daughter of the Emperor Theodosius, captured during the sack, eventually married voluntarily to the Gothic king, they moved into Gaul, and then into the Iberian Peninsula, and then, most astonishing of all, they began to build. Ataulf made a statement that was recorded by a Roman writer named Orosius, and it is one of the most remarkable things any leader said in the 5th century. He said that he had originally wanted to destroy the Roman name and replace it with a Gothic empire, that he had wanted to make all of it Gothic where it had been Roman, and then he had changed his mind, because he had come to understand that the Goths were too shaped by their own laws and instincts to maintain the complex machinery of Roman-style civilization without transformation. And so instead, he had decided he would use Gothic strength to restore Roman civilization, that his glory would be to stand as the restorer of Rome, not its destroyer. That is not the speech of a savage. That is the speech of a man who has thought seriously about power and governance and the relationship between a conquering people and the world they have entered. It is also, in its strange way, the speech of someone who has been so thoroughly shaped by Rome that he cannot imagine the future except in Roman terms, who has so completely absorbed the idea that Rome is civilization, that even in the moment of Rome's apparent defeat, he cannot let go of it. That tension between the Gothic world and the Roman world, between the instinct to replace and the compulsion to restore, between the pride of a people who had survived everything and the pull of the empire they had grown up in the shadow of, it does not resolve with Ataulf's speech. It lives. It moves west into what will become the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia. It moves north and east into what will become the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. It shapes every negotiation, every law code, every cathedral built, and every manuscript copied in the centuries of Gothic governance that follow the fall of Rome. Because the fall of Rome was not the end of the Gothic story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, the chapter in which the Goths stopped being the people at the gates and started being the people who had to figure out how to run things. A Gothic king named Theodoric the Great ruled Italy for more than 3 decades at the end of the 5th and beginning of the 6th century. His court at Ravenna was one of the most sophisticated centers of learning and art and governance in the post-Roman world. A Visigothic king named Receswinth promulgated a law code in Iberia that applied equally to Goths and Romans, that explicitly ended the legal separation between the two peoples, that said, "You are one." Gothic women in Iberia wore jewelry that fused Roman goldworking traditions with the polychrome garnet style the Goths had carried from the Ukrainian steppe, creating something neither purely Roman nor purely Gothic, but genuinely new. Gothic scribes copied classical manuscripts and kept them alive through centuries when, without that copying, they would have been lost. And the law codes, the ones the Gothic kings began writing down as they governed their post-Roman kingdoms, introduced something that Roman law had never prioritized in the same way: the concept of individual rights as a check on the power of rulers. Roman law was ultimately the emperor's law. It could be changed by imperial decree. It served the state. The Gothic tradition, specifically as preserved in the Visigothic law code and the Code of Theodoric, worked from a different premise. The law existed to protect the community, including from its own leaders. The king was not above the law. The king was subject to it, and the weregild tradition, that sophisticated mechanism for resolving violence through compensation rather than escalation, embedded itself in Germanic legal practice in ways that would echo forward through centuries of European legal development. The people Rome called the destroyers of civilization were also, unmistakably, its inheritors, its transmitters, the hands through which the ancient world passed into the medieval one. The most visible evidence of this inheritance stands over every major European city that still has a cathedral. Stand in front of Notre Dame in Paris, or Chartres, or the Cologne Cathedral, and understand that you are looking at the material evidence of a profound psychological transformation, not just an architectural one. The Roman world built wide. It built horizontal. The Pantheon, the Colosseum, the great basilicas. These are structures that spread across the earth, that anchor themselves to the ground, that derive their power from mass and solidity and the suggestion that nothing could move them. They are the architecture of an empire that believed in permanence. They are magnificent. They are also, in a specific and important sense, earthbound. The Gothic cathedral, and remember, Gothic in the architectural sense does not mean built by Goths. It is the label Renaissance scholars attached to the soaring, pointed style of the high medieval period. Reaches. It cannot help itself. Every structural innovation of that architectural tradition, every flying buttress and pointed arch and ribbed vault, exists for one purpose: to push the walls higher, to let the light in, to create the sensation of a space that is straining upward, that is not content with the earth, that is always reaching for something above and beyond. Why would a civilization spend generations and centuries and unimaginable amounts of human labor building structures whose defining characteristic is that they refuse to stay on the ground? The answer is not purely theological, though theology is part of it. The answer is also psychological, cultural, temperamental. The Germanic peoples who shaped the post-Roman world had a fundamentally different relationship to permanence than Rome did. Rome worshipped permanence. It built permanence. The Gothic world had learned, through centuries of crisis and the shattering of everything they had built on the Ukrainian steppe, that permanence was a lie the earth tells you to keep you from moving when you need to move. What was durable was not the wall, but the people inside it. Not the building, but the community. Not the thing, but the reaching. And so, when the heirs of that world began to build cathedrals, they built buildings that reached, buildings that moved your eyes upward, buildings that made you feel small, not in the crushing, imperial way of a Roman basilica, but in the vertiginous, terrifying, magnificent way of standing at the edge of something enormous and looking up. Walk inside Chartres on a winter afternoon when the light comes through the west rose window at a low angle and the colors move across the stone floor, blue and red and the amber of old glass. The ceiling so far above you that the air between you and it has its own texture, its own almost liquid quality. Your eyes go up. They cannot help it. And in that involuntary upward movement of your gaze is something that the historical Goths, the farmers and craftspeople and warriors and priests who had carried their culture across a continent, would have recognized immediately. Not the specific building, not the Christian theology, but the reaching itself, the refusal to be satisfied with what is, when what could be is still out there, somewhere above the sight line, just beyond the next horizon. The transformation from the people who crossed the Baltic in 3 ships to the civilization that built Chartres is not a mystery. It is the longest and most consequential journey in Western cultural history, and the Goths are at its beginning. Their goldwork fed into the Merovingian jewelry tradition that dazzled the Frankish courts. Their legal principles embedded themselves in the codes that would eventually branch into European legal thought. Their scribes, working in Gothic-governed territories, copied the classical manuscripts that made the later recovery of ancient knowledge possible. Theodoric's court gave Cassiodorus the political stability he needed to begin his great project of systematic textual preservation. The Visigothic kingdom of Iberia gave Isidore of Seville the framework within which he wrote the Etymologiae, the encyclopedia that kept classical knowledge organized and accessible for centuries of medieval scholars. The Renaissance intellectuals who coined the term Gothic as an insult could not see any of this from inside their own moment. They were looking at the medieval world and judging it as a falling off from the classical ideal. What they could not see was that the valley between ancient Rome and their own gleaming recovery was not empty. It was full of Gothic and post-Gothic cultures doing the unglamorous, essential, irreplaceable work of keeping the thread intact so that the Renaissance could eventually find it and pull. And that word, their insult, traveled with the thread, Gothic. It attached itself to the cathedrals they dismissed. It attached itself to the literary tradition that emerged in the 18th century as a deliberate counter to Enlightenment rationalism. The Gothic novel, with its ruins and its ghosts, and its feeling that the past is never fully past, that the rational order of things is thinner than we pretend. It attached itself to every subsequent wave of art and music and fashion that reached for the dark and the dramatic and the beautiful in its brokenness. And in each attachment, the word carried something of its origin, the charge of the outsider, the one at the gate, the one whose name the powerful used as a weapon, and who survived long enough to make it mean something else entirely. The Goths crossed a river in the 4th century in the shadow of a catastrophe they had not chosen, carrying everything that mattered to them in their hands and in their memories. Rome called them savages. Rome used them and betrayed them, and then blamed them for the consequences of that betrayal. And they went on. They built kingdoms and law codes, and preserved the manuscripts that would survive into the modern world. They carried a way of understanding loyalty and justice and beauty that did not disappear when their kingdoms fell. It dissolved into the population. It became the substrate. It flowed forward through every tradition that came after. The word survived, twisted, repurposed, loaded with meanings its original bearers would not have recognized, but alive, still moving, the way the Goths themselves always moved, forward, through whatever the world put in front of them, carrying what could not be put down.